5 days after my husband told me I was imagining things, his mistress rang my doorbell at 8:14 on a Tuesday morning and introduced herself before I'd even fully opened the door. I was still wearing the gray robe I'd bought at the hospital gift shop because it was the only thing soft enough not to press against the fresh incision across my abdomen. My hair was unwashed. My tea had gone cold on the side table. And standing on my porch in cream heels that were already sinking into the damp wood was a woman I had never seen before, looking at me with the kind of pity people practice in mirrors. "You're Elena, right?" she asked. I nodded because I was too startled not to. She lifted her chin a little, like courage had to be physically held in place. "My name is Sienna. Grant told me you were the reason he's been miserable for years. He said you'd probably try to make me feel guilty, so I wanted to come tell you myself. He's leaving you. And honestly, after everything he's told me, I think it's for the best. There are moments in life when reality doesn't break all at once. It goes thin first. The porch rail. The wet geranium pot by the steps. The blue recycling bin my husband always forgot to drag back in after collection day. Everything was still there, but it all looked lightly outlined, like I was seeing my own life through tracing paper. He told you that, I said, and my own voice sounded oddly calm in my ears, almost gentle. Sienna mistook that calm for weakness. People often do. She tucked a strand of glossy dark hair behind one ear and gave me a smile so rehearsed it was almost professional. He told me a lot more than that. Then her eyes dropped, just briefly, to the bandage visible at the collar of my robe. "I know you've had some health issues. He said you used that stuff to keep him trapped." Health issues. That was what she called the surgery I'd had 6 days earlier, the emergency surgery Grant nearly missed because he had turned his phone off during what he later said was a work dinner. Health issues. As if my body had developed a flaw specifically to inconvenience him. I should explain something here, because if I start with the mistress at the door and nothing else, it sounds like my marriage exploded out of nowhere, and it didn't. It eroded. Quietly. Respect first, then tenderness, then the basic assumption that I was a person whose pain counted. 21 years. That's how long I had been married to Grant Mercer, and for most of that time I was the woman everyone described as steady. Reliable. The one who remembered birthdays and doctor appointments and the exact brand of cereal his mother liked when she stayed with us. The one who could host 12 people for Thanksgiving and somehow still sit down with lipstick on. The one who kept the books for Grant's construction company when it was just him and one beat-up truck and a magnetic sign on the driver's side door. The one who turned invoices into systems and systems into payroll and payroll into the version of success he liked to take credit for over bourbon with clients. I wasn't flashy. I wasn't loud. I was useful. And if you've ever spent enough years being useful, you know how dangerous that role becomes. People start to confuse your reliability with endlessness. Sienna was still talking on my porch, filling the silence because she thought silence meant she was winning. "I'm not here to fight with you," she said. "I just think woman to woman, you should know the truth. He said the marriage has been dead for years. He said you refused to let him go because you need his money and you like playing the victim." That almost made me laugh. Not because it was funny. Because it was so astonishingly wrong it briefly tipped into absurdity. My husband's money. The porch beneath Sienna's expensive shoes belonged to me before Grant and I ever met. The house behind me belonged to me because my grandmother signed it over 10 years ago when arthritis made stairs impossible and she moved into assisted living. Grant had never paid the mortgage because there was no mortgage. He paid utilities sometimes, business dinners often, and compliments almost never. My money had started his company. My bookkeeping had stabilized it. My credit had secured the equipment line. But none of that was visible from the porch. What Sienna saw was a pale woman in a robe, one hand pressed lightly against a healing abdomen, blinking in the morning light like she had been dragged into a conversation she didn't understand. She took my silence as permission to go further. "He said you haven't been a real wife to him in a long time." There it was. Not just infidelity. A thesis statement. A justification polished enough to hand to another woman. I looked at her then, really looked. She couldn't have been more than 30. Maybe 31. Beautiful in the deliberate way that comes from time, money, and the belief that the future is something still happening to other people. Her manicure was flawless. Her coat was too light for the weather. She had driven all the way to my house to deliver a line he had fed her, and the strangest thing was I didn't hate her. Not then. I hated the ease with which my life had apparently become a story told around me by someone who benefited from my silence. "Did he tell you," I asked, "that I was in surgery last Wednesday?" Her expression flickered. "Just once. He said it was a minor procedure." It was not. I shifted my weight and the movement pulled at the stitches hard enough to bring tears to my eyes. I didn't let them fall. He also forgot to mention that while I was still in recovery, he asked me to sign documents I hadn't read. Now she went very still. That was the first crack. Small, but real. "What documents?" she asked. "That's interesting," I said softly. "He didn't tell you that part either?" A car passed at the end of the street, bass thudding faintly through closed windows. Somewhere 2 houses down a dog barked twice, then stopped. Ordinary morning sounds. It offended me a little that betrayal could arrive in the middle of something so normal. Sienna straightened, recovering herself. "Look, I didn't come here for legal details. I came because I thought you deserved honesty." Honesty. Coming from the woman standing in front of me wearing the perfume I later realized had been lingering on my husband's jackets for months. "If you really wanted honesty," I said, "you should ask him why he turned his phone off the night I was taken to the hospital." That landed. I saw it land. Her mouth opened, then closed again. She looked suddenly younger, and much less sure of what version of the story she had stepped into. I could have ended it there. Closed the door. Gone back to my cold tea and my pain medication and the awful quiet that follows a shock. Instead I asked the question that had been forming since the moment she said my name. "How long?" She hesitated. 8 months. 8 months. Long enough for habits. Long enough for lies to develop architecture. Long enough for him to build a second version of himself and furnish it with details stolen from my life. I nodded once. "Thank you," I said. That surprised her more than anger would have. "That's it?" she asked. "You're not going to scream?" "No," I said, and for the first time since opening the door I felt something sharper than pain move through me. Not rage. Recognition. "I think you've already brought me everything I need." When she left, she did it less confidently than she had arrived. She glanced back once from the walkway, as if she expected me to collapse dramatically into the doorway and prove Grant right about whatever story he had sold her. I didn't. I shut the door, locked it, and stood in my silent front hall with one hand still on the brass deadbolt, breathing carefully through the pull in my abdomen. Then I walked to the kitchen, opened the drawer where I kept house documents, and took out the folder labeled Mercer Construction Holdings. By the time Grant came home that night, I had already found 3 things he never imagined I'd need to look for. The first thing was the operating agreement for the company. The second was the refinancing packet Grant had slid toward me in the hospital with a pen balanced on top as if that made it harmless. The third was the bank statement for the business account ending in 4418, the one I had stopped monitoring daily after Grant insisted, 18 months earlier, that he needed space to run things like a real CEO. I still remember that phrase because it sounded ridiculous in our kitchen, where the dog bowl used to sit and the grout between the tiles needed bleaching. A real CEO. As if legitimacy came from excluding the person who had built the ledgers he now wanted private. I sat at the kitchen table with my heating pad wrapped around my middle and read through 73 pages of legal and financial language while the clock above the stove clicked forward 1 hard second at a time. What I found was not subtle. Payments to a boutique hotel across town. Jewelry stores I had never visited. Restaurant charges on nights he claimed he was meeting subcontractors. Monthly transfers into a personal account I didn't recognize. There was even a furniture purchase from a high-end store Sienna had once posted on social media, though I didn't know that yet. I only knew the amount looked too specific to be random. 15 years earlier, when the company was struggling to get a line of credit for equipment, the bank had insisted that whoever provided the collateral maintain controlling interest. That person was me. My inheritance. My credit score. My risk. Grant had signed because without my signature there was no expansion, no second truck, no warehouse lease, no polished version of the business card he now handed out like he'd built everything with grit alone. The agreement was clear. I owned 51%. Not ceremonially. Not emotionally. Legally. Enough to remove him from operational authority under defined misconduct clauses. I read that paragraph 3 times. Then a fourth. And because clarity has its own strange appetite, I kept going. Buried in the refinancing packet was a request to use my house as additional collateral for a new equipment purchase. He hadn't explained it that way in the hospital. He'd said, just routine paperwork. Insurance wants everything updated while you're awake and available. Awake and available. Morphine had blurred the edges of the room. A nurse had been adjusting my I had asked him to leave the forms on the tray so I could read them later, and he'd sighed like I was making life difficult on purpose. Then he'd taken them back when my doctor walked in. If I had signed, my debt-free house would have become leverage for business liabilities I knew nothing about. I set the papers down and stared through the kitchen window into the backyard. The maple tree my grandmother planted when I was 10 had started dropping leaves early that year, a few bright gold ones scattered over the patio furniture Grant kept promising to store before winter. I wondered how many promises in a marriage fail not because of one spectacular betrayal, but because one person slowly learns the other will clean up after every broken word. I called my friend Mara first. She'd been a lawyer for nearly 20 years and the kind of woman who heard a tremor in your breathing before you ever said what was wrong. She answered on the second ring. "Elena," she said. "Are you okay?" "No," I said, and then because my voice threatened to crack, I made myself continue before feeling could overtake structure. "I need you to tell me what a majority owner can do if the minority partner has been using company funds for personal expenses and trying to encumber separate property without informed consent." There was a beat of silence. Then her voice changed. Grew cleaner. More precise. "How much pain medication are you on?" Enough to hate stairs, not enough to misunderstand bank fraud. She exhaled once, which in Mara language meant concern mixed with admiration. "All right. Start at the beginning." So I did. The mistress at the door. The lies. The hospital packet. The statements. Grant's slow transformation from husband to someone who apparently narrated me as an obstacle in his side life. Mara listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said, "Do not confront him tonight. Screenshot everything. Duplicate the documents. Change the passwords on anything that is solely yours." "And Elena?" "Yes? If the house is still deeded solely to you, he cannot refinance against it without your informed signature, and if he tried to secure your signature while you were post-operative and medicated, that matters." I looked down at the incision instructions still clipped to the refrigerator with a grocery store magnet. No lifting. No driving for 2 weeks. Monitor for fever. Watch for signs of infection. Nothing in that tidy list accounted for the possibility that your marriage might start bleeding out while your body was trying to close. What if I already knew this was bad before today? I asked. What if I just didn't want to name it? Then today named it for you, Mara said gently. And now you decide what happens next. Grant came home at 6:42 carrying takeout from the Thai place I liked, which almost made it worse. Betrayal is rarely efficient enough to erase habit. He kicked off his shoes by the bench, loosened his tie, and called from the hall, "How are you feeling?" like he was auditioning for a role he no longer remembered how to play. I was at the table with the company folder closed beside me and a mug of chamomile cooling between my hands. Sore, I said. True. You should rest, he said, setting the takeout on the counter. I brought soup. I watched him move around my kitchen, opening drawers without looking because the muscle memory of our life was still intact even if the trust wasn't. Tall. Controlled. Still handsome in that maddeningly familiar way. 21 years teaches you the geometry of a person's body better than any language ever could. You know how they reach for glasses on the top shelf. How they stand when they're lying. How their face settles when they think they are unobserved. Grant turned toward me and smiled, but it never reached his eyes. Did you have anyone by today? He asked casually. There it was. Not guilt. Risk management. Yes, I said. A woman named Sienna. He froze so completely it looked almost theatrical, like a still frame inserted into film. Then the smile came back too quickly. I don't know any Sienna. That was when I understood the next phase of the story would not be confession. It would be strategy. If Grant had shouted that night, if he had broken down and admitted everything in some ugly flood of half-truth and self-pity, the next few weeks might have unfolded differently. I might have wasted energy responding to emotion. But Grant did what men like Grant often do when the first lie fails. He moved to the second one with smoother posture. Maybe she had the wrong house, he said, unpacking spring rolls into a bowl as if this conversation were only mildly inconvenient. Or maybe she's one of those people who read too much online and decide everyone is having an affair. I looked at him for a long moment, taking in the steady hands, the careful voice, the deliberate ordinariness of the scene. Betrayal is strange that way. Sometimes it doesn't look like broken glass. Sometimes it looks like your husband arranging chopsticks while pretending another woman didn't just stand on your porch and quote his private complaints back to you. She knew my name, I said. She knew details about my surgery. Grant's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Then maybe somebody from the office has been talking. People gossip. He didn't ask what else she said. That omission told me more than any confession could have. An innocent man asks for details. A guilty man asks how much you know. He set a container of soup in front of me and rested one hand lightly on the chair beside mine, performing concern with the practiced ease of someone who believed gestures mattered more than truth. Elena, you've been under a lot of stress. Between the surgery and the pain meds, maybe this feels bigger than it is. There are sentences that change the temperature in a room. That was one of them. Not because it was cruel in a dramatic way. Because it was administrative. He was trying to file my reality under instability. I thought of the forms in the hospital. The way he had chosen that moment, of all moments, to seek a signature. My body weakened. My mind supposedly questionable. Convenient. Pain meds don't create women on front porches, I said. He withdrew his hand. I'm trying to help. No, I said. You're trying to manage. He looked at me then, really looked, and something old in our marriage shifted against its frame. Grant had always relied on my reluctance to escalate. He knew I disliked scenes. Knew I preferred quiet, then clarity, then action in that order. For years he'd mistaken that sequence for passivity. What exactly do you think is going on? He asked. I think, I said, that if I answered that tonight, I'd only be saving you the work of crafting your own explanation. I took the soup to the bedroom and locked the door behind me, which I had never done in 21 years of marriage. The click of the lock sounded louder than it should have. On the nightstand my phone lit up with a message from an unknown number. I already knew who it was before I opened it. You should know, he said. He's been sleeping in the guest room for months. I don't want to be dragged into drama, but I won't be lied about either. Attached were 3 screenshots. The first was a photo of Grant in a navy shirt I'd bought him last Christmas, sitting at a restaurant table beneath low amber lights. The second was part of a message thread. Can't wait to wake up beside you for real. Soon. She's too checked out to notice anything. The third was a selfie of the two of them in what looked like a hotel mirror, her face half hidden against his shoulder, his wedding ring conspicuously absent. I stared at the screen until the letters blurred. Then I forwarded everything to Mara and wrote only, "He's escalating the gaslighting." Her answer came back in under a minute. "Good. Let him. Liars are sloppiest when they think they're still in control." The next morning I did something I had not done in years. I opened the laptop I used to keep separate from house browsing and logged into the archived bookkeeping files for Mercer Construction. Grant thought I no longer had access because he had changed the active credentials. What he'd forgotten was that I had built redundancy into everything when the company was small, back when one missed invoice could mean we didn't cover payroll. Old habits. Old safeguards. In the archives I found 6 months of vendor records that didn't match current expenses, duplicate payments routed through a consulting line item, and reimbursement requests from Grant that included hotel stays during supposed out-of-town site visits. By noon I had created a spreadsheet. Dates. Charges. Claimed purpose. Actual pattern. It looked clinical. That helped. Pain becomes easier to carry when you can sort it into columns. Around 2 that afternoon, Sienna texted again. "He says you're refusing to let him go because everything is in your name. Is that true?" I read that message 3 times, not because I needed to, but because it revealed something important. Grant had told her enough to justify secrecy, but not enough to clarify power. She knew assets were connected to me. She did not know how connected. I answered carefully. "If you're interested in the truth, you should ask why a man building a future with you tried to put my house up as collateral last week while I was in a hospital bed." 3 dots appeared, vanished, then appeared again. Finally, "I don't know what that means." Of course she didn't. Women like Sienna are not stupid, despite the lazy way these stories are often told. But there is a difference between intelligence and information, and Grant had made sure she never possessed enough of the second to fully test the first. That evening my daughter Nora called from Chicago. She worked in sports marketing, lived on coffee and deadlines, and had inherited precisely none of my instinct to soften bad news before delivering it. "Dad just texted asking if you're resting," she said. "So obviously something is wrong. What happened?" I told her a shortened version, leaving out the financial details until I knew more. When I finished, there was silence, then a long exhale. "I swear to God," she said quietly, "if he used your surgery as cover for paperwork, I'm flying home." "Don't," I said. "Not yet. Mom." "Nora." She knew that tone. The one I used when I had already moved from injury into planning. "I'm not asking you to pretend this is fine. I'm asking you to let me handle the first move." "You have a first move?" I looked down at the spreadsheet open beside me, at the ownership clause highlighted in yellow, at the hotel selfie sitting in my inbox like evidence from a stranger's life that had somehow landed inside mine. "I have the beginning of one." After we hung up, I walked slowly through the house, hand trailing along familiar surfaces. The console table by the stairs. The framed photo from our 20th anniversary trip, which suddenly looked less like romance and more like a well-lit lie. The den where I used to reconcile receipts late into the night while Grant talked loudly on speakerphone about leadership. Everything felt intact and ruined at once. In the guest room closet, behind extra blankets and the suitcase Nora used in college, I found the portable lockbox where Grant kept old contracts. Inside, beneath inspection reports and a sealed envelope of warranty papers, was a lease agreement for an apartment downtown beginning 3 months earlier. 1 bedroom. Furnished. Short-term, renewable. He wasn't leaving me. He had already begun. He just hadn't bothered to tell the person whose life he was rearranging. I sat on the edge of the guest bed until the pain in my abdomen told me to move. Then I stood, closed the lockbox, and made a list of everyone who would need to hear the truth directly from me before Grant had the chance to narrate it first. The list began with Mara and ended with Warren Bell, the accountant who had prepared Mercer Construction's taxes for 11 years and liked me enough to return my calls before coffee. In the middle were three names I stared at longer than I expected: Nora, my cousin Diane, and Grant's sister Claire. Family, in these situations, becomes its own separate legal system. Not the kind written in statutes, but the kind enforced through old loyalties, selective memory, and the deeply American urge to protect appearances. If Grant reached them first, I knew exactly how I'd be described. Fragile. Overreacting. Recovering from surgery and therefore not herself. That phrase had been waiting in the wings of my marriage for years, I realized. Not spoken aloud, but available. A trapdoor explanation for any inconvenient resistance. By 9 the next morning, Warren was at my kitchen table with reading glasses low on his nose and the expression of a man who would rather be discussing depreciation schedules than adultery. I respected that about him. He did not pretend emotion was his area. He simply followed numbers until they told the truth. I handed him the folder, the screenshots, and the printout of suspect charges. He took his time. Page after page. Statement after statement. Once he looked up and asked, "Did Grant have authorization for executive reimbursements above $5,000 without second sign-off?" "Only if I countersigned." "Did you?" "No." Another page turned. "Then we may have several problems, and only one of them is marital." There is a clarity that comes from professional understatement. Several problems. By noon Warren had identified nearly $90,000 in questionable spending over 8 months. Some of it was obviously personal. Some was routed clumsily enough to suggest panic rather than expertise. And some appeared tied to a side project Grant had never disclosed to me, involving leased equipment and a planned spin-off venture with a partner whose name I didn't recognize. "Could he have been trying to launch something without you?" Warren asked. "Maybe. Or trying to leave with as much liquidity as possible." He leaned back in his chair. "Either way, if you decide to act, timing matters. Once he knows you know, money moves faster." Timing. It kept coming back to timing. Healing tissues. Bank transfers. Who tells the story first? Which lie reaches people before the documents do? I thanked Warren, promised to send secure copies, and after he left I called Claire. Of all Grant's family, she was the only one who had ever looked at me as a person rather than infrastructure. She answered while loading groceries into her car, judging by the clatter and the short distracted breaths. "Elena? Everything okay?" "No," I said. "And I need you to hear this from me before your brother starts shaping it." I expected denial. Defensiveness. What I got was silence so complete I had to check the screen to make sure the call hadn't dropped. Finally Claire said, "I knew something was off." "You did?" "He's been different for months. Secretive. Weirdly polished. And Mom mentioned he'd suddenly become interested in skincare, which is not proof of adultery, but it is not nothing for Grant." Against my will, I laughed. It hurt. "No," I said. "It's not nothing." I gave her the essentials. The Mistress. The accounts. The apartment lease. The refinancing packet in the hospital. Claire listened the way a person does when reality is assembling itself in front of her and she dislikes every piece. "Do you want me to talk to him?" she asked. "Not yet." "Then what do you want?" I turned toward the den where 2 banker boxes sat ready on the floor. In one were company records. In the other, copies of every house and trust document that tied my life together more securely than Grant realized. "I want witnesses later," I said. "And I want no confusion now." That afternoon I met Mara at her office because she refused to discuss strategy by phone once financial misconduct entered the conversation. Her conference room smelled faintly of lemon polish and old paper. She spread my documents across the table in tidy stacks and began building a timeline. Hospital admission. Surgery. Refinance attempt. Mistress appearance. Bank anomalies. Apartment lease. He's not just cheating, she said after 20 minutes. He's using the affair as cover while restructuring access to your assets. Hearing it phrased that way did something cold and useful inside me. It converted private humiliation into operational fact. Can I remove him from the company? I asked. Mara tapped the operating agreement. You can suspend his authority pending review under the misconduct and fiduciary breach clauses. But you need the process clean. Notice, meeting minutes, temporary controls, bank instruction. And Elena? Yes? Do not warn him. I had no intention of warning him. The old version of me might have. The woman who believed fairness meant giving someone every opportunity to prepare a defense. But fairness is not the same thing as volunteering for your own erasure. Over the next 3 days I moved more quietly than Grant ever thought possible because he had confused visible silence with lack of action. He kept coming home at unpredictable times, sometimes with takeout, sometimes with flowers, once with a new blanket because he claimed the hospital robe made me look uncomfortable. He kissed my forehead twice. Slept in the guest room once, our room the next night, probably calculating which performance best suited the moment. I watched and said very little. He mistook that, too. While he performed normalcy, I changed the password to every account connected solely to the house. I transferred copies of financial records to an encrypted drive and left it with Mara. I contacted the bank relationship manager and arranged a meeting for Friday morning under the pretext of estate planning updates. I pulled my grandmother's trust paperwork, the house deed, and the personal loan note I'd written years earlier when I injected my inheritance into Mercer Construction to keep it alive after a disastrous municipal delay nearly bankrupted us. Grant always said we got through that year together. The note reminded me that what he meant was I covered the fall and he enjoyed the recovery. On Thursday evening, while he showered upstairs, his phone lit up on the kitchen island. I was not a woman who had spent years snooping through devices. That isn't virtue, it's biography. I never felt the need until my reality was being actively rewritten. The preview on the screen read, "I'm tired of being the secret when you promised me Thanksgiving." My first thought was not heartbreak. It was logistics. Thanksgiving. He had a date in mind for some formal transition, some narrative rollout. A holiday. Public enough to legitimize. Late enough to keep extracting stability from me first. I did not open the phone. I simply photographed the preview with mine and set his device exactly where it had been. That night, after he fell asleep beside me smelling of cedar soap and deception, I lay awake and thought about all the ways women are expected to discover betrayal gracefully. Quietly. Without becoming inconvenient. I realized I no longer cared about grace in the decorative sense. I cared about precision. By Friday morning, precision had a time, a place, and a witness list. Friday began at the bank and ended with me standing in my own driveway watching a locksmith replace every exterior lock while the late afternoon sun turned the top branches of the maple tree copper. If that sounds dramatic, understand that nothing about it felt theatrical in the moment. It felt administrative. Necessary. Like finally scheduling a surgery you've delayed too long and then resenting only the pain of recovery, not the procedure itself. At 8:30 I sat across from Neil Hargrove, the bank manager who had once congratulated Grant on building something from scratch, while I stood 2 feet away holding the folder that made the line of credit possible. He remembered me better when I slid the operating agreement across his desk and asked for a freeze on non-essential outgoing transfers pending internal review. Neil's expression changed by degrees as he read. "Mrs. Mercer," he said carefully, "are you alleging unauthorized use of company funds?" "I am informing you," I said, "that the majority owner is initiating a formal misconduct review and that any attempt by Grant Mercer to add or leverage my separate residential property should be treated as disputed and unsupported absent my in-person notarized approval." Mara, seated beside me, added 2 sentences in lawyer language that made everything sound official enough to trigger institutional caution. That was the point. Caution buys time. Time prevents theft. By noon the bank had restricted large discretionary transfers. By 1, Warren had emailed a memo summarizing irregular spending for the corporate record. By 2, Mara's office had prepared notice of a special member meeting of Mercer Construction Holdings for Sunday afternoon. Required attendance. Agenda limited. Supporting documents attached. Grant would receive it Saturday morning, after the bank restrictions were already in place. Clean process. No warning. When I got home, I found him in the kitchen scrolling through his phone with a half-drained tumbler of sparkling water beside him. "How'd the follow-up appointment go?" he asked. He thought I had been at my surgeon's office. "Productive," I said. "Not a lie." "Good." He smiled without looking up. "I was thinking maybe next month, when you're feeling better, we could take a weekend away." That was the moment something in me finally detached from the old reflex to rescue his dignity. A weekend away. While he leased an apartment for another life. While his mistress texted him about Thanksgiving promises. While he tried to convert my house into collateral from a hospital room. "Grant," I said, and he looked up because I almost never used his name that way. "If a man lies often enough, does he start hearing his own voice as truth?" He blinked. "What?" "I'm asking if there's a point where performance becomes self-hypnosis." His expression hardened. "I have no idea what you're talking about." "That makes one of us." I left him standing there and went upstairs before my incision started burning. 3 hours later the locksmith arrived. Grant was in the den on a conference call, or pretending to be. I met the locksmith outside and signed the work order under my maiden name because the house document still carried it in certain lines, and somehow that steadied me. Elena Vale. The woman who existed before she learned to answer to Mercer as if it were synonymous with adulthood. While the front deadbolt was being replaced, my phone rang with Sienna's number. I let it ring once, twice, then answered. "What did you tell him?" she demanded before I could speak. No greeting. No attempt at poise. "Excuse me?" He's furious. He says the bank froze something and that you're trying to destroy his business because you can't accept the marriage is over. There it was again. My resistance translated into hysteria. My boundaries translated into revenge. My reality translated by a man terrified of documentation. "Did he mention the apartment lease?" I asked. Silence. "Then, what apartment?" "Interesting," I said. "Did he mention the nearly $90,000 in personal spending through company accounts?" "You're lying." "Am I?" I looked at the locksmith kneeling by the storm door, metal tools catching light in quick silver flashes. "Sienna, I don't know what version of this story you were sold. But if you're going to keep volunteering for a supporting role in Grant's collapse, at least ask for the full script." She hung up on me. At 6:10 that evening Grant found the new lock package on the hall table and the color left his face so quickly it startled even me. "Why are the locks being changed?" he asked. "Because I requested it." "Why would you do that?" I looked at him. Really looked. The expensive watch. The slight flush rising at his collar. The offended disbelief of a man encountering limits where he assumed only access existed. "Because this is my house," I said. "And beginning tonight, you don't come and go here without my permission." Anger moved through him too fast to disguise. "Your house," he said. "Are we seriously doing this? After everything I built?" "Yes," I said. "We're seriously doing accuracy." He took one step toward me and stopped, maybe remembering the incision, maybe remembering for the first time that witnesses existed beyond emotion. "Who's putting this in your head?" he asked. That question almost always follows the moment a controlling person realizes a woman has moved from confusion into certainty. They assume another voice must be present because their own can no longer direct the scene. "Documents," I said. "Bank records. Your phone. Your mistress. Pick one." He stared at me. Then, because denial had finally become too fragile to hold, he switched tactics. "I was going to tell you." "When?" "Soon." Before or after Thanksgiving? His eyes flickered. Tiny thing. But enough. You went through my phone. No, I said. Your lies went through my life. He exhaled sharply through his nose and turned away, then back again like he needed motion to think. This doesn't have to become ugly. It already did, I said. You just thought I wouldn't notice. At 7 o'clock I handed him an envelope. Inside was a copy of the special meeting notice, a temporary occupancy agreement requiring him to remove personal items within 72 hours, and a brief letter drafted by Mara stating that all discussions regarding company assets and residential access would proceed through council until further notice. He read the first page, then the second, then laughed once in disbelief. You're trying to push me out of my own life. No, I said. I'm refusing to be pushed out of mine. He slept elsewhere that night. I don't know if it was the apartment or a hotel or Sienna's place. I only know the house was quiet, and for the first time in weeks the quiet felt chosen. Saturday morning brought rain, low, steady and gray, the kind that makes the whole neighborhood seem to lower its voice. I spent the first hour of it at my dining room table with a legal pad, a heating pad, and a list of facts I wanted arranged in an order so clear even Grant's preferred version of events couldn't bend them. People imagine strength arrives in a burst. In my experience, it arrives in small organized stacks. Dates. Transfers. Leases. Lies. By 10, Nora had landed at O'Hare for a return flight she booked without my permission and therefore in the exact spirit of motherhood I had apparently passed on to her. She texted only, "Don't be mad. I'm coming anyway." Then another, "Also I have pastries." I smiled despite myself, which hurt less than it had earlier in the week. She arrived just after noon with a rolling suitcase, 2 bakery boxes, and the face she has had since age 6 whenever she decides an adult has behaved badly and requires correction. She hugged me carefully, then stepped back and looked at the house as if expecting to find evidence of emotional arson in the walls. "Where is he?" she asked. "Not here." "Good." She set the pastries down. I am trying so hard to have one mature reaction before I say what I really think. Have whichever one is easier. "Fine," she said. "I think he's a coward." That, at least, required no translation. Over coffee she reviewed the timeline with me, not because I needed her legal insight but because speaking it aloud to someone who loved me without agenda made the whole thing less surreal. When I got to Sienna's porch speech, Nora closed her eyes. "He sent his mistress to a post-op woman's front door." "She came on her own," I said. "He just loaded the gun." Nora leaned back in her chair. "That may be the most dad thing he has ever done." By late afternoon Claire arrived too, carrying a casserole dish she admitted she brought out of habit because she didn't know what else to do with her hands. She and Nora had always liked each other in the easy, conspiratorial way women sometimes do when they share a family but not the same illusions about it. We sat at the dining table and went through the company packet together. Claire grew paler with every page. "He told my parents you'd been distant for years," she said quietly. "He told them you were pushing him away." I laughed once, without humor. Convenient. Especially while I was doing payroll. "I'm sorry," she said. "I know sorry doesn't cover this." "No," I said. "But honesty helps." At 6 that evening Grant called. I put him on speaker because I was done allowing any part of my reality to happen in private when it affected everyone around me. "I want to talk," he said. His voice had changed again. Less arrogant. More careful. "Then come to the member meeting tomorrow," I said. "This isn't a board issue. You made it one when you used company funds for your affair and tried to leverage my property without informed consent." Claire looked down. Nora stared straight ahead, jaw tight. On the other end of the line Grant was silent just long enough to confirm the hit. Then he tried a softer route. "Elena, this is our marriage." "No," I said. "Our marriage was the thing you lied inside. This is the structure you tried to loot while lying." He inhaled sharply. You're turning everyone against me. No. Your paperwork is. He did not come that night. Instead, at 9:17, Sienna texted me. I'm outside. Alone. I considered ignoring it. Then I looked through the front window and saw her car idling at the curb, windshield shining with rain. When I opened the door, she stood there without the cream heels, without the posture, without the carefully arranged pity. She looked exhausted. He said you hacked his accounts, she said. He said you're trying to ruin him because you're jealous. And what do you think? I asked. She laughed once, bitterly. I think I signed a lease for a place he said we'd move into after the holidays. I think he told me the apartment downtown was for a project manager. I think I found out an hour ago that he spent last night there alone. She held out her phone. And I think he forgot that when people lie to two women at once, eventually one of them compares notes. The messages she showed me filled in what the financial documents could not. Promises. Schedules. Contradictions. He told her I refused intimacy because I despised him. He told me he was working late while texting her from hotel bars. He told her he was waiting for the right time to separate, but his timeline kept slipping whenever business cash tightened. Did he ever tell you, I asked, that the company is majority mine? She stared at me. No, did he tell you the house is mine too? No. Rain tapped steadily against the porch roof. Behind me I could hear Nora moving in the kitchen, cabinets opening, the familiar sounds of women making themselves useful in the middle of male destruction. Sienna lowered the phone. I know I'm not the victim here, she said quietly. I know what I did. But I didn't know all of it. That was the first truly honest sentence I had heard from anyone involved besides me. No, I said. You didn't. She looked up. What happens tomorrow? I thought of the meeting packet. The bank. Warren's memo. Claire's presence. Nora's fury. Mara's clean legal language. All of it arrayed not for revenge, but for truth with structure around it. Tomorrow, I said, he hears himself contradicted in full sentences. She nodded slowly, as if some last private fantasy had finally expired. If you need the messages, I'll send everything. Do that. She sent them before she even reached her car. At midnight, after Nora and Claire had gone to bed and the rain had eased into soft intermittent taps, I sat alone in the den with Sienna's file open on my laptop and realized something I wish I had understood years earlier. Betrayal doesn't only depend on the betrayer. It depends on every assumption that the betrayed person will choose silence over complication. Sunday would be complicated. Good. Let it be. The special member meeting was scheduled for 1 o'clock Sunday afternoon in the conference room above the warehouse, a space Grant had insisted on decorating himself last year when he decided the company needed to look more executive. That had meant charcoal walls, black metal shelves, and a reclaimed wood table so heavy 4 men had carried it up the stairs swearing under their breath. When I walked in with Mara at 12:47, Warren was already there with his files arranged in color-coded stacks and Neil from the bank seated near the window in a navy suit that made everything feel official in the useful, slightly suffocating way institutions always do. Claire came at 12:55. Nora at 12:58 carrying coffee for everyone except her father. Grant arrived exactly on time and stopped just inside the doorway when he saw who was present. What is this? He asked. He had dressed for confidence. Blue blazer. Open collar. Good watch. The face of a man who still believed charm could negotiate with evidence. A formal review, Mara said before I could answer. Please take a seat. He didn't. I'm not doing this with my daughter in the room. Nora, without looking up from her coffee lid, said, That's funny, because you seemed very comfortable making your mistress part of the family business. Claire closed her eyes briefly like someone bracing for impact. Grant turned to me. You brought her into this? You brought all of us into this, I said. Sit down. He did, though not gracefully. What followed took 93 minutes and changed the shape of my life more thoroughly than the affair itself. Affair's wound. Documentation rearranges power. Warren began with the spending summary. Dates, categories, unexplained reimbursements, hotel charges, personal transfers, duplicate vendor invoices masking non-business expenses. He spoke in the flat measured voice of a man reciting weather patterns, and that helped. Nothing lets a liar flail quite like precision. Grant interrupted twice. Once to call a charge client cultivation, once to say some records lacked context. Warren responded by producing the context. Receipts. Timestamps. Corresponding text records from Sienna that placed Grant in those hotels during supposed site visits. Mara then moved to the refinancing packet and asked Grant, directly, whether he had attempted to secure Elena Vale-Mercer's signature on property collateral forms during a post-operative hospital stay without full disclosure. He smiled then. A mistake. I brought papers for later review, he said. She's twisting that. Mara slid a copy across the table. His initials were on every flagged page. My signature line had been tabbed. Notes in his handwriting read sign here and not urgent but better now. Neil from the bank said quietly, for the record, the bank has no policy encouraging execution under sedation or active recovery. Grant's face changed. Not dramatically. He just stopped looking like a man at a meeting and started looking like a man realizing the room no longer belonged to him. Then came the operating agreement. 51% majority interest held by Elena Vale-Mercer through initial collateralization and continuing equity terms. Breach provisions. Suspension rights. Temporary transfer controls. Grant actually laughed when Mara read the ownership percentages aloud. Come on, he said, looking at me like I had pulled a trick from my sleeve instead of a document from our files. Everyone knows I built this company. With my capital, I said. My systems, my credit, my risk, and apparently your secret life on the expense account. He leaned forward. You never cared about the fieldwork. That's true, I said. I cared about whether payroll cleared. Nora made a short sound that was not quite a laugh. Claire stared at the table. Warren adjusted his glasses. Grant's next move was one I should have expected. He turned from facts to feeling, because facts had stopped helping him. This is about punishment, he said. Elena's upset about my personal life, so she's trying to destroy everything we built. It was astonishing how quickly he reached for the language of shared creation once assets were threatened. We built our company, our life. But only in peril. Never in gratitude. I opened my own folder then. Inside was the chronology I had made by hand, the one written not in lawyer language but in plain sentences any adult could follow. I read it aloud. Hospital admission. Emergency surgery. Phone off during contact window. Attempted collateral paperwork. Mistress at front door. Apartment lease. Undisclosed expenditures. Holiday promises made to affair partner while maintaining marital access to residence and finances. When I finished, the room was silent in the heavy way of places where everybody knows the truth has arrived and none of them enjoy its manners. Then there was a knock at the glass door. I didn't look surprised because I wasn't. Grant did. Mara had approved it that morning after I told her Sienna was willing to provide direct corroboration if necessary. Come in, I said. Sienna stepped into the room wearing a black coat and no visible confidence at all. For the first time since she appeared on my porch, she looked exactly like what she was, a woman who had discovered too late that she had auditioned for a fantasy role in a man's collapsing lie. Grant pushed back from the table. Absolutely not. Actually, Mara said, as a corroborating witness to disputed financial and factual representations, she may speak if invited. Nora's eyebrows rose. Claire covered her mouth with one hand. Grant stood. This is insane. Sit down, I said. He looked at me as if he expected the old Elena to appear, the one who would soothe, defer, retreat from discomfort to preserve a room. She did not. Slowly, furiously, he sat. Sienna didn't look at him when she spoke. She looked at me. He told me he was separated in every way except paperwork, she said. He told me the downtown apartment was temporary until he could move assets without conflict. He said Elena kept everything in her name to control him. He said the company should have been solely his a long time ago. Neil's expression sharpened at that. Warren began writing something down. Sienna continued, voice steadier now that truth was underway. He used business cards for travel. He told me that was normal. He told me the holidays would be our first public trip together. He told me Elena didn't understand the business and never would. Grant looked at me then, not with shame, but with anger so stripped down it almost looked like fear. He had not expected his two narratives to touch. That was his great miscalculation. Men like Grant rely on separation more than they rely on brilliance. Keep the wife in one box, the mistress in another, the money in a third, the family in a fourth, and call it management. Bring the boxes into one room and the whole architecture gives way. At 2:31, by formal vote, I suspended Grant's operational authority pending forensic review and directed the bank to require dual approval from me and Warren for any outgoing business transactions above routine payroll and existing vendor obligations. At 2:37 Mara handed Grant the draft separation terms for residential occupancy and financial disclosure. At 2:41 he said, "You're going to regret humiliating me like this." And that, more than the affair, was the sentence that ended my marriage. Not I'm sorry. Not I panicked. Not I ruined everything. Humiliation. His pain was never what he had done. It was that witnesses existed. The funny thing about public truth is that once it happens, the private theater collapses almost immediately. By Monday morning Grant was no longer a misunderstood husband trapped in a cold marriage. He was a suspended minority partner with frozen spending authority, an undisclosed apartment lease, and an affair partner who had already forwarded 216 pages of messages to my attorney. The speed of that transition would have startled me once. It no longer did. Lies are durable only while unchallenged. After that meeting, the challenge was everywhere. He called 16 times Sunday night. I answered none of them. Mara told me not to. A man who's been cornered will treat access like oxygen, she said. You don't owe him any more of yours. So I let the calls go to voicemail and listened later only because I needed to document tone. The first few were angry. Then wounded. Then imploring. By the 12th he had reached the phase where self-pity dresses itself up as intimacy. After everything we've been through, he said in one message, voice thick with theatrical exhaustion, I never thought you'd do this to me. To me. Even then. Even now. Monday at noon his mother called. Lorraine Mercer had the kind of voice that could make criticism sound like concern if you didn't know how to listen beneath the polish. Elena, she began, I'm sure there are misunderstandings on all sides. That sentence alone told me Claire had not yet given her the full version, or perhaps Lorraine had chosen not to absorb it. There are documents on all sides, I said. That's more reliable. A pause. Grant says you turned some little marital issue into a business ambush. Grant says many things. He's your husband. Legally, yes. Factually, he's the man who tried to use my recovery and my house to finance a life he was building around me. The line went so quiet I could hear the television in her background, some daytime host laughing too brightly at something trivial. When Lorraine spoke again, the righteousness had thinned. Is that true? Asked Claire. She did. And 2 hours later I received a text that said only, I did not know the whole story. For Lorraine, that was practically a confession. The practical aftermath was less cinematic than people imagine and more exhausting in 1,000 small ways. Grant's clothes had to be inventoried and collected. Shared accounts had to be separated. Utility logins changed. Insurance beneficiaries reviewed. My surgeon's office called to remind me not to lift more than 10 pounds, which forced the humiliating realization that even righteous life upheaval still has to respect stitches. Nora stayed the week, sleeping in her old room, taking calls from work in the den, glaring at anyone who used her father's name too gently. Claire came by twice with meals and once with a storage company recommendation because, as she put it, if a man insists on ruining his own life, he can at least do it with proper boxes. Even Sienna played a role I never expected. She and I were not friends. We would never be. But the world is more complicated than simple moral categories, and one of the oddest truths of that month was that the woman who helped wound me also helped verify the shape of the wound. She sent everything. Calendar invites. Gift receipts. Voice notes. A screenshot where Grant told her, "She's too sentimental to ever go nuclear." I stared at that line for a long time. Not because it hurt. Because it perfectly captured the arrogance beneath everything else. He had mistaken my decency for permanent disarmament. He had mistaken thoughtfulness for inability. He had mistaken the years I spent preserving peace for proof that I would always preserve his. On Wednesday I learned from Warren that Grant had tried to call 2 subcontractors privately and suggest that if things got messy, they might want to prepare for Elena making unstable decisions. Warren shut that down quickly by forwarding them the formal suspension notice and reminding them that vendor continuity depended on contractual compliance, not gossip. Still, the attempt shook me more than I expected. Not because it surprised me. Because it revealed how quickly a woman's credibility becomes the preferred target when evidence closes in around a man. I took that anger and used it. By Thursday Mara filed the petition for temporary exclusive possession of the residence and motioned for preservation of all business and personal financial records. On Friday I met with a forensic accountant who wore bright red glasses and described Grant as aggressively average at concealment, which remains one of the most comforting insults I have ever heard. She estimated the recoverable misuse might exceed the first $90,000 once all reimbursements and diverted payments were traced. He spent like someone who thinks love and accounting are both made of fog, she said. I nearly liked her immediately. That weekend, while sorting old papers in the den, I found a yellow legal pad from the year Grant started the company. On it, in my own handwriting, was a list titled Worst Case Survival Plan. I had written it during the second winter of the business, when we were behind on invoices, Nora needed braces, and our old furnace was making a death rattle in the basement. Underneath the title were line items in careful blue ink: postpone kitchen renovation, refinance car, use inheritance if absolutely necessary, keep house safe no matter what. I sat with that pad in my lap and understood something so simple it almost embarrassed me. I had always been the contingency plan. The reserve. The stabilizer. The thing he trusted enough to exploit because he assumed it would never stop functioning. Once you see that clearly, grief changes shape. It becomes less about losing the man you thought you had and more about mourning the years spent making yourself indispensable to someone who only valued what you prevented from collapsing. That Sunday, exactly 13 days after Sienna first appeared at my door, Grant came to collect the last of his clothes. Mara insisted a deputy be present for the exchange because legal caution had by then become a habit I respected. Grant looked thinner. Less polished. The expensive watch was gone. He carried garment bags out in silence until he reached the hall table and saw the framed photo of my grandmother I had moved there from the bedroom. You always put her everywhere, he said, as if the problem with our marriage had somehow been my loyalty to the dead woman who left me the house he tried to leverage. She taught me to keep what's mine in writing, I said. He laughed once under his breath. You really think you won? I looked past him through the open door at the maple tree, now almost bare, leaves collecting in the curve of the walkway. This isn't winning, I said. It's ending an arrangement that only worked because I kept paying for what you broke. For the first time, he had no answer. 3 months later the house felt like mine again, and that was not a poetic statement. It was physical. The air sat differently in the rooms. The silence no longer carried anticipation. I rearranged furniture not because I needed a makeover, But because muscle memory is stubborn and sometimes a chair in the wrong corner is enough to remind you that an old version of your life used to enter through a particular door at 6:42 each evening. The den became my office instead of his afterthought. I painted the bedroom a softer white. I replaced the mattress, which felt more intimate than replacing the man who had slept on it. Healing, I learned, is partly about refusing to preserve objects that collaborated with your unhappiness. The divorce itself moved with the tedious dignity of paperwork and scheduled hostility. Grant contested more than Mara expected and less than he threatened. Once forensic accounting pinned the diverted funds, his posture changed. Men become practical when fantasy stops paying. He agreed to a financial settlement that required repayment terms on misused company money, surrendered any claim to the house, and accepted a structured buyout of his minority stake over time, discounted heavily for misconduct. Warren called it a remarkably fair outcome given the facts. Nora called it getting off light. Both were probably right. Sienna disappeared from my daily life after forwarding everything she had and answering a final deposition request. I heard through Claire that she moved to another city for work. I wished her no special fate, good or bad. Some people enter your story as a weapon and leave it as evidence. That was enough. What surprised me most in those months was not the legal process or the financial cleanup. It was the social aftermath. How many women, once they heard a careful version of what happened, leaned toward me with that unmistakable expression of startled recognition. At the pharmacy. At physical therapy. At a neighborhood dinner where someone had clearly been briefed by Lorraine's revised public relations campaign. Women my age and older kept telling me different versions of the same sentence. I wish I had done what you did. Not the affair part, necessarily. Not the bank or the locks or the meeting. They meant the refusal. The moment of deciding not to protect the comfort of the person causing the damage. One evening in early winter Claire came over with soup and a potted rosemary plant she claimed could survive my tendency to forget watering schedules. We sat in the kitchen where so many quiet humiliations had once passed for marriage and talked in the easy way people do when nobody is managing the room for a man anymore. Mom's embarrassed, Claire admitted, stirring her tea. Not just about Grant. About how much she missed. People miss what excuses them, I said. She nodded. She wants to call you. Then she can. Will you answer? I thought about that. The old me would have answered immediately, not because she was ready, but because someone else was. The new me understood readiness should not be a one-way courtesy. Maybe, I said. If she calls to understand, not to edit. Claire smiled sadly. That is such a specific line. It took me years to learn it. My follow-up scan in December came back clear. No complications. Good healing. When my surgeon said those words, I nearly cried from the sheer novelty of hearing my body described without implication or blame attached to it. Good healing. I carried that phrase home like a gift. That night I opened the hall closet and found the hospital robe folded on the top shelf beside a stack of old blankets. For a moment I just held it. The thin gray fabric. The tag from the gift shop. The softness that had mattered when my skin hurt and my life was splitting open in a way I did not yet understand. Then I put it in the donation pile. Not because I wanted to erase what happened. Because I no longer needed to dress myself in the costume of that week. In January, Mercer Construction finalized its rebrand. I dropped Mercer. Kept Vale. Some names fit only while you were trying to survive them. Vale felt like mine in the mouth. Clean. Unborrowed. True. A week after the rebrand, Lorraine finally called. I answered because I was ready, not because she was. She was quiet for longer than usual, then said, I should have asked better questions. It was not everything. But it was real, and real is rarer than perfect. Yes, I said. You should have. She cried a little. I did not. Not because I was hard. Because I was done dissolving on cue for other people's comfort. When we hung up, I made tea, opened the front door, and stood on the porch where Sienna had first delivered the lie Grant built for both of us. The boards were dry now. The geraniums were gone for the season. The air had that sharp winter cleanliness that makes everything feel outlined and possible. I remember thinking that being seen is not the same thing as being chosen. For years I had been chosen for labor, for stability, for forgiveness, for silence. Finally, I chose myself for something better. And once I did, the whole story changed.